Okay, welcome. I'm Sally Redmond, president of the Duxbury Rural Historical Society Trustees, and I'd like to call the DRHS Society 2021 annual meeting to order.
From Dorchester, Boston Fire says one person was injured in this fire on Glenway Street. Everyone else who lives there made it out okay.
Somebody needs to mute themselves.
I'm going to mute everyone. I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone except for Sally right now, just to get the show started here.
Okay. I ended last year's annual meeting saying, and now we're going into an exciting 2020. It's going to be fascinating and engaging. Fascinating, maybe, certainly. Engaging, yes, as it pertains to the programs and the innovations that Erin and the staff created to engage our members through the pandemic, but not so much in actually getting together. So it's really nice to see you all here. Your tremendous support for this year was critical to the success and the health of the society and in getting through the challenging year. We thank you deeply. Now a few procedurals. We will be voting on a new member of the Board of Trustees. You received the nominating committee report in your annual meeting invitation. And the annual reports will be mailed out to you around March 1st. I have a note here to please be advised that everybody mute themselves, but you've already been muted, so that doesn't need to be done. But we do advise you that this meeting is being recorded for future use. And now David Udy, the treasurer, will give us the financial report. David?
Thanks very much, Sally. Greetings to everyone from Sugar Bush, Vermont. Dick, yes. Dick Morris, yes, I did do a couple Castle Rock runs today to prepare for tonight. Thank you for that introduction. I just have some brief written remarks and a couple quick comments, and then we can keep the meeting going with Erin's executive director report. Through very careful management of our finances, endowment, revenue, and expenses, the DRHS exhibited careful yet innovative responsibility in a very difficult year, which goes without saying. With crucial support of many friends and supporters, the DRHS carried on with important mission-driven projects in education and preservation. The unique pressures of this year of extended closures and of the loss of program revenue made it clear that in order to ensure a dynamic future, the DRHS must continue to maintain and grow its financial base in a number of areas, including fundraising support, membership, endowment, and planned giving, and capital project funding, as well as revenue supporting programs. It's really a testament to the strength of this organization to date that the DRHS structure holds strong and is operating well, having balanced a challenging budget and finished the fiscal year of 2020 with a surplus of $8,404, which is great. That doesn't mean that this coming year won't be a challenge, so we don't want folks to think to rest on their laurels with supporting the organization. Many, many thanks to the volunteers of the Board of Trustees, as well as on the finance and investment committees who help oversee this crucial work. And I just want to mention a few of those. Chris Sherman and his committee on the investment committee did a wonderful job this year guiding us through the storm. The Board of Trustees did a fantastic job. I can't say enough about Erin's job and her attentiveness to the budget and to finding innovative ways that we could streamline our expenses, but also provide value to our members. And also to Paul Casey for doing all of his CPA work for the board, and also our great staff that works with Erin to accomplish those things. So I just want to say thank you to all those folks. As well as to the hundreds of donors and members who make financial contributions every year to this organization through thick and thin. Thank you very much also to the granting agencies that are supporting organizations like ours. We couldn't do it without you. DRHS will receive expanded financial information and provide that in the printed annual report next month. And full financial reports can be requested from the DRH offices at any time. So I just want to thank you. It's been my honor to serve as treasurer this year, and we look forward to a good year in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for guiding us through the difficult year for you helping guide us through the difficult year, and for your succinct and informative report on our financial standing. And now Erin McGow, our Executive Director, will give her annual report.
Thank you, Sally. Our mission and passion at the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society is to preserve, store, and educate about Duxbury, where history and rural landscape have shaped this special place, past, present, and future. We care deeply about inspiring our growing community and hope that you are filled with a similar passion for this place. DRHS has been a part of the fabric of this community for 137 years. But in 2020, our work never felt more important. With the walls of our world closing in and with an uncertain future, it was essential to stay connected to one another and to this very special place. The theme for this year was Place Matters, and it was something that was talked about throughout the last year. This year, the DRHS explored and delivered new ways to come to you wherever you were. We forged a new path for historic and rural preservation, education, and most of all, conversation and connection. With Tony Kelso, the town historian, we held virtual neighborhood walking tours, and we partnered with the Duxbury Free Library for the historic Duxbury Lego contest. We offered self-guided tours of Duxbury's history and of local cemeteries, and we encouraged children who might have been anxious about returning to school in September to learn about Duxbury's schoolhouses throughout the centuries. Like you, we spent most of 2020 with our physical doors closed, but thanks to you and to your support, we flung our virtual doors wide open. Our intrepid staff tucked away their plans and went to work exploring new and exciting online program ideas, like our first online exhibition, Creating a Legacy, 400 Years of Duxbury and the Pilgrims. We developed innovative approaches for amplifying our mission, created opportunities to interpret and share history in new ways, and we worked to engage new audiences with new website offerings for all ages, including our new online learning page where you can explore Duxbury's history, lands, and people from anywhere and from any time. Our updates on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook are full daily with pictures and historic stories and informational tidbits. And our Dateboard House page on our website features the house histories of dozens of antique dateboarded houses in Duxbury. And through it all, the work continued. Our collections were cataloged, new acquisitions were made, research was completed, and inquiries were answered. Our focus may have shifted with the pandemic, but our mission did not. Restoration work at the King Caesar House was completed, with more than $100,000 generously funded by the Community Preservation Act in Duxbury and the Massachusetts Cultural Council. Our Lands Committee continued to embrace its expanded mission to create professional guidelines and stewardship expectations for the parcels that have been entrusted to the DRHS in the lands portfolio. And they laid the groundwork for a stewardship partnership with the Wildlands Trust. Important conservation restrictions were placed on key parcels of lands, legally protecting them for future generations. We also completed important capital maintenance planning to provide long-range forecasts for our historic structures through a properties assessment, which was completed. It laid the groundwork for a multi-year plan for increased funding for updating and maintaining our historic structures. This project was jointly proposed by the Properties and Investment Committees and was approved by the Board of Trustees. Many of our in-person events and programs were curtailed, but our many volunteers continued their hard work on committees, in the gardens, collections, and the lands. It was especially heartwarming to see the response to programs like Christmas at King Caesar, which had its 49th year this year, and all the wonderful handmade ornaments that adorned our community tree and reminded us of the community all around us. I'd like to offer a special thank you to the volunteers in development, fundraising, and finance who helped us to steady our ship and to recalibrate our year. And to all of our volunteers, a heartfelt message. We miss you, and we cannot wait to be together again. I'd also like to thank our incredible staff, each and every one of them, but especially Carly Olson, who left us in September after 6 wonderful years. Her dedication to the organization and her warm smile in the office will be missed. But of course, we wish her well in her new life in Williamsburg, Virginia. And we welcome new office administrator, Cheryl Lalonde, who joined us in October. We began this new year with gratitude for the support of so many in a difficult year, and with a renewed focus on making the next year a fulfilling one, whatever it brings. Perhaps when we cannot see ahead, we can let history guide us. Your generous friendship and support make it all possible. We could not do this work without you. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. And thank you all for the work that you've done, Erin and our staff, Carolyn Ravenscroft, Melanie Correa, Sabrina Kaplan, and our new office administrator, Cheryl Lalonde, and Deb Casgrande, the volunteer chair. All of you have worked successfully to not only hit, but surpass our yearly goals in a very challenging time. And now, Amy Annis, the chair of the nominating committee, will present the new nominee for election on the Board of Trustees. And in a little while, I'll explain, once she's done, I'll explain how the vote will work.
Thank you, Sally, and good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure as the chair of the nominating committee to present the nominating committee's nominations for the following individuals for election or re-election to the Board of Trustees. New trustee for election, Joy Bannon is elected for a term expiring in 2024. Joy Bannon has 2 decades of experience in public relations and event planning for nonprofit and corporate clients and extensive volunteer experience, including being an active member of the DRHS, serving as a docent and chairing both KCH Christmas and the Summer Tea Party. Locally, Joy has also volunteered at the Duxbury Public Schools and Berrybrook School. Joy is an avid horseback rider, and she loves to spend time at the beach or on her family's boat. Joy graduated from the University of San Diego with a bachelor's degree in communications, and she resides in Duxbury with her husband, Brian, and her 2 children, Paige and Parker. Trustees for re-election. Paul Wales is nominated for a term expiring in 2024. Jane Talmadge O'Farrell is nominated for a term expiring in 2024. Donna Wood is completing her interim board term and is nominated for her first term expiring in 2024. The above candidates per the bylaws of the Society are nominated for the terms indicated. Also in accordance with the bylaws, members who intend to nominate a candidate from the floor of the annual meeting should mail notice to the Society's office together with the commitment that the nominated person agrees to serve. The above nominees have demonstrated a genuine commitment to the well-being of the Society and the greater community. They are exceptionally talented, knowledgeable, and will be outstanding additions to the leadership of the Society.
Thank you, Amy. Now I ask if there are any nominations from the floor or the screen. Okay, it seems that they are not. So, Erin, what is the situation of our voters?
Okay, it appears that you have no phone voters, so we can just do the poll.
Okay, good. Now we're doing the poll. We're going to do, we're only doing one poll, the digital poll. For those of you that are attending tonight by computer or connected digital service, the poll vote will pop up and ask you to click on the option to vote aye to accept the nominations as read, or nay if you do not agree with the nominations as read.
Are you ready to go, Sally?
I'm ready to go.
All right, I'm launching the polling, everyone.
Okay.
And it seems to be working. If everyone can get their vote in, please. Okay, Sally, it seems to be holding steady. It seems like everyone who's able to vote has, and it's unanimous. It's been approved.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to recognize particularly an outgoing board member, Amy Annis, who just completed her last act on the Board of Trustees. We are going to miss her terribly. We recognize the contribution and service of her longtime outgoing board member, under whose gentle guidance the DRHS has prospered and grown stronger. Amy is a two-term board member and has long served as a member of the Collections Committee and the Nominating Committee. And she took over the chairmanship of the Nominating Committee this last year. Amy is also a longtime volunteer in a number of other areas, including educational programs. Amy has been a steadfast supporter of preservation and our educational mission. And we look forward to having her continue as a volunteer in other areas. Thank you very much, Amy. As I said, we will miss you.
I'm not going to. Thank you for that, Sally.
You're very welcome, and I'm sorry you're going. And Erin will now present the Volunteer Recognitions Awards.
Thank you, Sally. In a typical year at the DRHS, hundreds of volunteers make our work possible. This wasn't a typical year, but perhaps more than other years, it seems appropriate to recognize all of the volunteers who help to keep us going. In honor of all volunteers, we'd like to recognize a few outstanding ones by presenting our annual Volunteer Recognition Awards. This year's new volunteer award goes to Owen and Scott Farrell for their help in property maintenance and cleanup at the Nathaniel Windsor Junior House and the King Caesar House. Owen has been a Boy Scout for 4 years and completed the work as a requirement for his citizenship in the Community Merit Badge. Then he and his father took on some additional projects as well. Owen and Scott, thank you. This year's award in Lands and Gardens goes to the Community Garden Club of Duxbury. A long-standing partnership, these amazing volunteers donate their labor, resources, goods, and money fundraised to keep both the DRHS gardens and the town of Duxbury beautiful. Thank you to the Community Garden Club of Duxbury and to all of its volunteers. The award in activities goes to the Duxbury Free Library Children's Department. They have been one of our most supportive partners for years, and this year we were grateful for their partnership in a number of programs, including the Story Walk on Bumpus during Christmas at King Caesar and the Historic Duxbury Lego Contest. Thank you to this fellow Duxbury institution. This year's award in education goes to Barbara Hayes. Education comes in all forms, sometimes reaching out to the public, and sometimes we have to educate ourselves as an organization. Barbara's lessons in strategic and organizational planning, even for me, were particularly essential this year, and we are very grateful to her. Thank you, Barbara, for all of your help. This year's award for preservation goes to a group of volunteers, the Investment Committee. Chris Sherman, Senior Chair, Dick Morse, David Udi, John Baer, Ken Johnston, Robert Loring, and David Thompson. The unsung heroes of our financial picture, these careful managers of our endowment and investments, have long preserved the financial wellness of our organization and ensured our longevity with their acumen and their expertise. Thank you, gentlemen. And finally, our Volunteer of the Year is a special award, and we award it to Mary Ott. The finest of managers, Mary co-chairs the Historic Gardens Committee and sits on the Properties Committee. In addition to countless hours in our gardens, she was this year engaged with a number of important projects, including preparing the gardens at King Caesar House for filming and overseeing clean-out projects. Mary's energy and eye for design are unparalleled, and we are grateful to have her on our side. Mary could not join us tonight, but I know you will all join me in sending her a warm DRHS thank you. Congratulations to all of this year's recipients. Your gifts are in the mail, And we thank each of our volunteers across the spectrum of our activities. Thank you for helping the DRHS this year.
Thank you, Erin, and hey, thank you all to the receivers of the volunteer awards. I'm a fervent believer in volunteering, and it's just wonderful to see all of the people who volunteer for this organization. And now, is there any other business to bring before the meeting? Does anybody have anything they want to bring before the meeting? Okay, well, with no further business, I would like to entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting. Adjourn the meeting. Or join, you've already joined. Can I have a motion from any one of you verbally? Oh, they're muted.
So moved.
Okay, thank you, Dick. Second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, just say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. The meeting is adjourned. Stay safe. We value all of you.
Now we're going to ask all of you to please stay on the line. We do have a special guest speaker, Lyle Nyberg, who will be presenting on the history of the South Shore suffragists, including their Duxbury connections. It's my pleasure to welcome our guest. Mr. Nyberg's recently published book, Summer Suffragists, includes suffrage activists with Duxbury connections, including Judith Windsor Smith and her husband, Sylvanus, both important suffragists. Their papers are preserved at the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society's Drew Archival Library, and both of them are buried in Mayflower Cemetery in Duxbury. Mr. Nyberg is a historian in Scituate. He has documented more than 50 historic buildings in Scituate, Boston, Pembroke, and Duxbury, including ones important for women's suffrage. He graduated from Dartmouth College and Boston University School of Law. He is a member of the Scituate Historical Society, a volunteer for the Historical Commission, and a member of the Massachusetts Historical Society. He gives talks on history, and he was a panelist for a League of Women Voters presentation in 2020 on the fight for the vote. I ask that everyone please hold their questions for Mr. Nyberg until the end of the presentation and then drop them into the chat feature on your screen. I'll pull the questions for him from there as moderator at the end of the presentation. Thank you for your cooperation with that. And with that, I welcome Mr. Nyberg. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Erin, and thank you to DRHS for giving me the chance to talk about the suffragists of Duxbury. And I was struck by your introduction. I forgot a year ago I was talking about the fight for the vote, and I didn't know it was going to be so prophetic. It certainly was the year of the fight for the vote. But you know, last year was a celebration of 100 years since the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the vote. And there's a lot of what they did to achieve the vote that rings that echoes in today. And I want to highlight some of the characters and people who participated in that, particularly those from Duxbury. So I have a presentation here, and let's see, pardon the, I'm not an expert at this by any means, but I'm going to share the screen. Okay, whiteboard. Okay, it's not coming up.
Okay. If you're having trouble, I can pull it up on my end and then you can just move me through your slides. Just 1 second, please.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, no problem. Just give me 1 second to load it up. There you go.
Okay, let's see. All right, you can, next one, please. So Duxbury, it turns out, was home to nationally significant suffragists. I call them the Smiths and the Moores, although I'm usually using their first names too. And it's worthwhile talking about how I got here from Situate, actually. I was thinking about, I've been doing some research and I found some Duxbury connections. And then a year and a half ago, I came across the name of Judith Windsor Smith. And I emailed the Drew Archival Library because they have a collection of her papers and her family's papers there. And the next thing you know, I got an email from Carolyn Ravenscroft who said, you know, Judith Windsor Smith is a pretty important name down here in Duxbury. So the next thing you know, I drove down 3A and I wound up looking at the records at the Drew Archival Library, and the society really should be proud of that place. It was a wonderful place to do research, and it's a terrific building, and it has a lot of terrific material. And Carolyn was really helpful, so I want to thank her for that. And that really kicked off my the book that I wrote, Summer Suffragists, involving those of Situate. But I got to tell you, the heart of that book is with Judith Windsor Smith and her husband Sylvanus. And I'll be talking about them later. I want to talk about a few others first. So just the very day that book came out last August, the DRHS was having a Zoom talk by a guy who wrote a book about the clipper ships. There was some mention of Duxbury, but not enough for me, and maybe not enough for you, but he does touch on them. But in the chat room, a descendant of Sylvanus and Judith Smith got in touch with me. And the next thing you know, she got me encouraged to write about the shipbuilders of East Boston. So I've kind of wandered from one subject to another, but I think it's important to talk about them, and I'll be talking about them in the presentation here too. Before we get to the Smiths, though, let's talk about the Moores. Next chart. William Moore was a Duxbury native. His father was Reverend Josiah Moore, who actually married Sylvanus and Judith Smith at the Unitarian Church. He attended Partridge Academy in Duxbury, Harvard College, and then he went on to serve as an officer in the United States Navy. He retired from there about 1910, then became a Massachusetts state representative from Duxbury. His wife had actually bought the old family house of the Moores, which is shown here on the right. It's at 942 Tremont Street. It's still there. This picture is from the state database on historical artifacts and buildings called MACRIS, M-A-C-R-I-S. This was actually just the third form that was filed for Duxbury. So that tells you some of the significance of this building. But anyway, back to William Moore. He, in 1910, was also one of the original members of the Massachusetts Men's League for women's suffrage. So he was an early suffragist. It's appropriate to start off with a man as being in favor of women's suffrage. This was a new organization that actually it started in New York State and spread across the country pretty quickly, but Massachusetts had a very strong chapter of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage. Next chart, please. His second wife was Carol Moore, and his daughter by his first wife was Mary Moore Forrest, and they both played important roles in the women's suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913. This was the first big parade in Washington, D.C., and it was, of course, the largest women's suffrage procession up to then. There'd been, in the previous few years, there had been parades in New York City that were well attended, but this was a mammoth, a monster procession, as they called it, and it led to a lot of good publicity for the women's suffrage movement. You see on the right is the official program for the women's suffrage procession. That's available on the Library of Congress website, and it's really worth taking a look at, but they profile about 50 of the suffragists who helped organize this parade. And two of them are shown here. That's Carol Moore and Marie Moore Forrest, her stepdaughter. They both lived in Washington, D.C. at the time, but they were spending summers in Duxbury. And Mary Moore Forrest, later, a few years after this parade, joined Alice Paul in the National Women's Party, which was the more militant branch of the women's suffrage movement. And she lasted with that party into the 1940s. So she was a long time influence and leader of the party. She served on their executive board. Next chart, please. Well, we come to the Smiths. Sylvanus, some usually spelled S-I-L-V-A-N-U-S, Smith, and Judith Smith, who are nationally significant suffragists. Next chart, please. Those photos are courtesy of the DRHS. Judith, just to give you overall biographical information about them, they're both Mayflower descendants. Judith was born in Marshfield in Brent Rock, which was actually about as close to Duxbury as you can get. Sylvanus was born in Duxbury. I'll show you where he lived in a few moments. His father was a sea captain, Jonathan Smith, and her father was a groundskeeper for shipbuilder Ezra Weston. She came to Duxbury to teach at the Millbrook School, sorry, and that's probably how they met. She and he married in 1841 at the First Church, Unitarian, which had just been built in 1840, I understand. So the church was only a year old. And as I mentioned before, William Moore's father, Reverend Moore, officiated at the wedding. Later, a few years after living in Duxbury, they moved to Pembroke, where they had a farm. Sylvanus worked on shipbuilding on the North River, which was practically in their backyard. And that was a big shipbuilding center, as was Duxbury at the time. But the center of gravity for shipbuilding moved up to East Boston. And that's where he moved, and the family moved in 1854. And then 22 years later, in 1872, he built a house at 76 White Street in East Boston. Somewhere along the line, they became followers of Reverend Theodore Parker, who was kind of he was a Unitarian minister who actually, let's say, migrated away, became involved in some other movements, and wound up having the largest congregation in Boston. Around 1873, that's the earliest I could find is evidence that the Smiths spent summers in Scituate, and I think for the rest of their lives. Next chart, please. So I like maps. This is from 1833, a wonderful map by John Ford. And I've circled some key sites here. On the left, at the far left, is the Millbrook School. This is the previous building there, or maybe two previous buildings there. Today, it would be, there's a building there, and it's just west of 3A. And then moving east to the right, the circled building there is the home of Captain Jonathan Smith, Sylvanus's father. So Sylvanus grew up there, but he was born just south of there. If you move down to the circled building on Washington Street, that's 612 Washington Street, both those buildings are still there. And moving to the right is Ezra Weston's big property and the wharf where I believe ships were built at the time. Again, I'm not an expert at shipbuilding, but this map gives you an idea how close everything was at the time, all relatively within walking distance. Next chart, please. Here's a terrific photo of the family. This is on display at the Drew Archival Center. It shows the entire Smith family and their 6 children. Sylvanus is in the center. Judith is at the right, I guess looking at Sylvanus. And in her lap is their youngest child, Jenny, who was born in 1865. So you can tell from this photo, it was probably taken in the late 1860s. Okay, next chart, please. So just a brief summary of East Boston. Many of you have probably heard of Donald McKay. It certainly was a key character in that talk last fall about the clipper ships, and he was the leading builder of clipper ships. They were built for speed, and they were built to run from the US to China to pick up tea as it was being harvested and then brought back fresh for the Americans. But there were other ship builders at the time who were important, and all 3 of these I consider some of the top shipbuilders at the time. Samuel Hall, Paul Curtis, and Sylvanus Smith. And if you look at their backgrounds, by the way, on the right of the chart are their periods of work in East Boston. But if you look at their backgrounds, they all came from the South Shore, and many of them had worked in Duxbury, some I believe for Ezra Weston, particularly Samuel Hall. And they're all connected somehow. For example, Sylvanus Smith, 20 years later, would wind up building a house next to Donald McKay. Sylvanus Smith first came to East Boston and started working for Samuel Hall, and then later became his foreman. And then later, Sylvanus Smith partnered with Paul Curtis. I should also mention that there was a family relationship between Sylvanus and Samuel Hall, both of whom had Duxbury backgrounds, but Sylvanus and Judith's daughter their daughter had married a grandson of Samuel Hall's brother. So they were connected by marriage as well as by these other shipbuilding and geographic sites. So next chart, please. This shows a detail of a map from, I forget when, about 1860, showing where these shipbuilding sites were. It shows Curtis, Smith, Hall, and McKay. At the top one, Curtis, is at the foot of White Street. And if you go up the hill just about 2 blocks, that's where Sylvanus Smith and his family and Donald McKay and his family lived. So they all could get to work pretty easily. Just roll down the hill. Next chart, please. Here's a wonderful illustration of shipbuilding in progress at the shipyards. This is from 1855. The story that went with this referred to this as a glorious rivalry among the shipbuilders. I think there were a lot more connections and family relations and friendships than there were rivalries, but there may have been that too. I love this illustration because it shows the carpenters at work in the foreground, working on logs, turning them into planks, the planks being carried up the steep ramp to the top of the ship that looks like it was pretty close to completion. And then in the background, you can see the State House in Boston at the top of Beacon Hill. And at the right is the Bunker Hill Monument. So it gives you a good idea of the busy shipbuilding in East Boston. Next chart, please. Here's a ship that he built. This is all those 4 gentlemen that I mentioned had built over 50 ships. So that's one reason why we consider them important. But this is called the Centennial. It was obviously built in honor of the 100 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It had its maiden voyage to Philadelphia, which was really appropriate because, well, for 2 reasons. One is because this was designed to run between Philadelphia and California, which had become famous for its gold and was becoming very prosperous. The other reason for going to Philadelphia was because it was hosting the country's first World's Fair, which was in honor of the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. So it was a great place to go. The family and friends saw the ship off, and the Smith's daughter, Mary, accidentally locked herself in the captain's closet. And so she was not found until they were already underway. And so we consider her a stowaway. And that's covered in a subchapter of my book. The ship also sailed to England, which is shown in this painting, and to Hong Kong, which is shown in an oil painting that was in the family for many years. And I should mention that the figurehead on this was carved by a really famous Boston wood carver named Herbert Gleason. And believe it or not, it survived all these years, and it's in the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, although it's in their cellars and collection. They're not out, it's not being displayed. Next chart, please. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, this is the Sylvanus and Judith Smith House, the one that he built in 1872, sorry. This is how it looks pretty recently. I think they did a wonderful job renovating it. It's right next to the Donald McKay House, which is shown at the right here. You can just barely make out the white columns. There are 13 of them, one for each of the colonies at the time. So it's a very famous historic house. And actually, the East Boston Historical Society is in the process of acquiring that. If anyone's interested, they could use some ideas for buying it and some funding for it as well. Although they have received some Community Preservation Act funding. Next chart, please. Let me give you a kind of a suffrage timeline. The first part deals with Judith and Sylvanus. The next part gives some highlights in the 20th century that I thought were important. So in the 1830s already, Judith as a young girl and her mother were early suffragists. In 1862, there was a list of donors for the anti-slavery actions. The list shows up in William Lloyd Garrison's famous newspaper, The Liberator. And years later, the Smiths became friends with William Lloyd Garrison's son, who was also named William Lloyd Garrison. So they were very much involved with the anti-slavery movement. It's important to know that the suffrage movement had grown out of the anti-slavery movement shortly after the beginnings. The 15th Amendment was passed in 1870 that gave African-American men the vote. It was hoped that women would get the vote next in America. It took a long time for that to happen. It did not happen right away. In that year, Lucy Stone, which is one of the top 5 suffragists in the country, founded the Woman's Journal in Boston. She was basically a Boston, Massachusetts person. And in 1876, Judith and Sylvanus's niece, Catherine Kate Wild of Duxbury, who's highlighted in one of the, the blogs by Carolyn Ravenscroft. She began work there. Judith had put in a good word for her. And Kate wound up being an editor later on in the career, working at the Woman's Journal. I should mention the Woman's Journal is probably the leading suffrage journal that lasted from 1870 until 1917, then came back to life later on as well. But this is the publication that got the word out across America about the suffrage movement. In 1878, it turns out Sylvanus, not Judith, became an officer of the East Boston Women's Suffrage Club. So he had the honor of maybe being the first of the two to be an officer, but Judith soon caught up and wound up being an officer in all the national suffrage organizations that were located in Boston, the Mass Women's Suffrage Association, the New England Women's Suffrage Association, et cetera, et cetera. All right, now look at the national level. We had the suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. was a big event, and the Moors were involved in that. In 1914 and 1915, there were similar parades in Boston. The edge there was that there was a referendum in not only Massachusetts in 1915, but on the same day, similar referendums in New York State, Pennsylvania, and I think New Jersey. 4 New England states were voting on the women's right to vote. It failed resoundingly. All the voters were men, and it turned out to be a 2-to-1 ratio. 2/3 of the men voted against women having the right to vote. New York cured its error 2 years later and voted to allow women, but Massachusetts never did until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. 1917 was also a key turning point. The National Women's Party, which was the militant wing, sent out silent sentinels to stand in front of the White House, and later they picketed the White House. And later some of them were arrested and thrown in jail, and while they weren't necessarily popular at first, their jailing probably helped the suffrage movement. Next chart, please. I mentioned Lucy Stone. You can't talk about suffrage without talking about Lucy Stone. So she's shown here. She has a ton of photos on the web that you can look for. This one I like is because it shows her with her daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell. Lucy Stone married Henry B. Blackwell, but she never changed her name, which meant that she could not vote when women are allowed to vote. She could not vote because they only allowed women to vote if they used their married names. And they didn't consider Lucy Stone to be a married name. And Judith Windsor Smith is on the right. I show them together because they were great friends. And Alice Stone Blackwell, here shown as a baby, when she grew up, she was great friends with Judith. Everybody loved Judith. And everybody was seemed to be close friends, but I would say that she was one of the top closest friends of Lucy and her daughter Alice. And it turns out in my latest research that Lucy had been friends with Judith's parents. I'm guessing McLaughlin was her father's name, but Polly Hathaway was her mother, and she was from Duxbury. And so the ties between Lucy Stone and Duxbury go way, way back. Next chart, please. Here's kind of a busy resume of Judith Windsor Smith. At the end of her life, she was called the world's oldest suffrage orator, which I think is really appropriate, at least for America. I haven't done the research outside of America. But back in the beginning, 1875, she founded the Home Club of East Boston. This was like only the second women's club in Massachusetts, and she served as its president for 10 years. She started, this basically was a forum for having speeches and having people listen and become educated. The first speakers were Julia Ward Howe and Mary A. Livermore. And I'll talk more about Mary Livermore in a minute. Anyway, let's move on to the next chart. But I wanted to show that just as her dedication and persistence over the 70 years from 1870 to 1920. Here's it's a photo. It's really a composite photo because all these women were not there at the same time. I guess it was an early version of Photoshop, but this was from 1884. So it's a nice old photo showing 12 eminent women. Judith Smith is not in this. Lucy Stone is not either, but there are three people here worth noting who did have connections and strong connections with Judith Smith. Mary Livermore, I mentioned, it turns out she also taught in Duxbury and found her husband in Duxbury. He was a minister at one of the other churches in Duxbury. And she later became the first editor of the Woman's Journal and then went out to speak around the country on women's suffrage, women's rights, and other issues. So she definitely belonged in this illustration. Louisa May Alcott, who is a famous name, she and Julia Ward Howe were all members of the Theodore Parker's 28th Congregational Society of Boston, along with Judith and Sylvanus Smith. And next chart, please. This shows the building built in 1872 by followers of Reverend Parker, who had died by then. But the congregation had been going strong. This is in South Boston at Boylston and, not Boylston. Oh, sorry. Well, anyway, it's in South Boston and it's still there. And surprisingly, it was never documented in the state database on cultural resources. So I took it on myself to document this thing and filed it sometime last year. But it gives you a good idea of a building in which they would have meetings and so forth. Next chart, please. Speaking of suffrage, this shows, you probably know this site. This is Park Street Station in downtown Boston. That's Park Street Church on the right, and it's Park Street running up the hill towards the State House. And halfway up the street are some lighter colored buildings that are no longer there, but some of the other ones are. The lighter colored buildings were the home for a long time of the Women's Journal and almost all the other suffrage organizations at the time, from 1870 through about the early 1900s. This is where Judith Windsor Smith would spend a lot of her time, helping out with the Women's Journal and so forth. So it was easy for her to get over to Boston because there was a ferry that cost a nickel just to get across from East Boston over to Boston itself. Next chart, please. I mentioned that the family spent summers in Scituate, and they spent it at an iconic place, maybe the iconic place in Scituate, the lighthouse. And this was the lighthouse keeper's cottage. And the lighthouse, you can see, had no more light on top, and it had been abandoned by the federal government about 1850s anyway. By 1873, a guy named Samuel Hall had been named as the caretaker for the property, just to keep vandals out of this property that was still owned by the federal government. And this was the son of the Samuel Hall that I mentioned before, that was a shipbuilder in East Boston, and who had originally come from building ships in Duxbury. So through that family connection, the Smiths were able to spend at first the 4th of July weekends here. Later in the 1800s, they would spend a week, and by the 1880s, they were spending the whole month of July. So I guess they had the privileged time periods at this place. Next chart, please. Here is a photo of the family along with their friends from Duxbury. This again is at the Drew Archival Library. It's a great photo. It shows, well, it's kind of labeled on the back, but they don't tie to individuals, so it's kind of hard to tell. But I believe that's Sylvanus Smith in the center with the hat in the center and the white beard and mustache. And to his right, a woman turned around in her chair, looking back at us. I just realized from another document is Clara Drew Smith, 1830 to 1911. There's a great blog post by Carolyn Ravenscroft about her on your website. And she was the widow of Sylvanus's brother, who was also he was Captain Jonathan Smith. And then that little girl with the hat seated on the ground on the right, that is Clara's granddaughter, Helen Clapp. I'd like to know more if anyone knows who Helen Clapp is or was, and her descendants. I'd like to know more about that. That's a pretty common name in Scituate, by the way. Next chart. By the way, the last chart, Sylvanus had built that canopy, and it shows up in some early photos of the lighthouse by itself. And then later they were, I guess they were kicked out of the lighthouse keeper's cottage. And in any event, they decided to build their own cottage. It's shown here as the second one from the left. You can see it's taller than most of the others. It's, I've been inside it, it's still there. It's 2.5 stories. The top story is kind of a loft for sleeping, and it's a cute little place. Built in 1896, and that's where the Smith family and their descendants spent summers for decades. Next chart. That was also, you can stay here, but that cottage is just about 7 cottages away from the lighthouse. So they're right next to the water, just like they were in East Boston and just like they were in Duxbury originally. So Judith became famous as she aged. She worked very hard for the suffrage movement and gave speeches in 1913, and 1914, and 1915. And by 1915, that suffrage parade that I mentioned that was developed to build up interest and votes for the referendum in favor of women voters. That parade got a lot of attention in the Boston Globe and other newspapers. The Globe had headlines in which Judith Smith is mentioned in the same breath with Helen Keller on the lower left there. And on the right, she's shown in a photo driving the carriage of Judith Smith, of Lucy Stone. So it looks like she's got the reins of that horse. So she was still pretty active at the time, and she had a place of honor in that parade. I think she was leading the second battalion of people. Next chart, please. And when the 19th Amendment passed, there was enough time, at least in Massachusetts and most other states, for women to vote for president. And in this article, Judith encouraged everybody, all the women, to vote, even if it rains outside or if there are other adverse effects, because this was a really key event. So she wound up getting to vote at age 100. Next chart. And the final resting place for Judith and Sylvanus is at the Mayflower Cemetery in Duxbury, and there are also other family members there. Sidney Smith, I see, and Mary are buried nearby there. So they returned to Duxbury. Next chart, please. Just to conclude, the Smiths were key suffragists from Duxbury, East Boston, and Scituate. The Moores were key suffragists from Duxbury, Washington, D.C., and Scituate. And Judith Smith is a great example for all of us in persisting in the fight for women to vote and in voting herself from the 1870s, if not earlier, up to 1920. Next chart, please. If you want to know more, I've written a lot more about these people in my book, which is available on Amazon, and also Buttonwood Books up Route 3 or 3A in Cohasset, next to Shaw's. And you can just Google Judith Windsor Smith. You get lots of information there. The Patriot Ledger had a nice article last August. The DRHS and the Mass Historical Society have some great collections if you want to go into more detail. And I have a website that has much more detail, including some recipes that Judith Smith came up with and submitted for a cookbook that the suffragists put out to raise funds for the suffrage movement. And if worse comes to worse, you can contact me at my website, lylenyberg.com. So thank you very much for your attention. Be happy to take any questions you have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lyle. Those of you who do have questions, please find your chat box at the end of, at the bottom of your screen, or you may be on a phone, it could be somewhere else, but there is a chat box available. You can drop your questions in there. I do ask you that you stay muted because it gets confusing otherwise. As they start to come in, I'll pass them on. I already have one. One that came to me during your talk. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired Judith Windsor Smith, or maybe more generally suffragists in general, to fight for suffrage?
Oh, well, I can speak for Judith. I think it was the influence of her mother and father, who were both very strong believers in social justice. And, you know, the slavery issue was big for them, and the suffrage movement, suffrage issue was also important for them. So it has to do with their parents.
And Peter Rapley asks, what role did Civil War nurses play in the suffrage movement? We have the Bradford sisters or Louisa May Alcott. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the women helping as nurses in the Civil War, I think, showed everyone in the country that they could do more than just take care of the home. And they were appreciated for what they could do. So I think that was really important nationally. I got to say that Mary Livermore, I think, was one who had moved out to Chicago from Massachusetts and then got involved in what was called the Sanitary Commission. And that was basically the nurses and other people who were helping out soldiers and other people who needed help during the Civil War. So she was deeply involved in that. So there was a lot of connections there. I'm not an expert in that field, but I wanted to mention that anyway.
Meredith Loring, oh, sorry, I just scrolled on me. Meredith Loring Golden asks about churches, the role of the churches, and specifically the role of the First Church of Duxbury involvement in the suffrage movement.
Oh, well, I can't say for sure about the First Church of Duxbury. I assume this is the Unitarian one that Reverend Josiah Moore was the pastor of. If you go by what his son was, who was a strong proponent of women's suffrage, you know, he must have been influenced by his father as well as his mother. And it's my feeling that that church at the time was pretty liberal. Reverend Theodore Parker took it to another whole level. And he was important for many of the suffragists. I think Julia Ward Howe was a member of his church, and I couldn't trace it how far back, but certainly Judith and Sylvana Smith and others involved in the suffrage movement were strong members of the Parker's church. And in fact, Parker gave one of the earliest very strong sermons favoring women's role in politics, not just women's suffrage, not just being able to vote, but also being able to participate in the political process. And this was 1853, so that's really darn early in the suffrage movement. Next question.
Sure. Susanna says, I noticed that it was the Notman Publishing Company that published the photo of 12 eminent women. Does the name represent something special? Why no men, I think is what she's asking.
Notman Photography, don't get me started on this, but this is a wonderful organization that started in Canada by an immigrant and became one of the leading. If you look at the museum up there, they have a whole section devoted to the Notman photography business. But they had a major branch in Boston. It was one of their 4 or 5 top branches in the United States. And they photographed everybody. They did a terrific job. And they were noted for these composite photos like I showed you. They're also noted for taking photos of the prominent people at the time. It turns out their offices were at 3 Park Street. So it'd be very easy for Lucy Stone, for her daughter, and for Judith Windsor Smith, and for her whole family, actually just go downstairs or upstairs to their studios and have their photos taken. So this is a terrific coincidence, more than a coincidence, but they did an awful lot of very famous people's photos. Thanks for the question, that's great.
Are there any suffrage historic sites in Scituate or elsewhere on the South Shore?
Well, there are a few, you know, they have not been well documented. In Scituate, there are sites left. I would say the lighthouse would qualify. There are others actually a block away from me which have been taken down in recent years, and others that were taken down decades ago that housed suffragists that I talk about in my book. And I actually have some photos of the old houses in the book, but unfortunately they're not there anymore. Other places in South Shore, I mentioned, I mentioned in your introduction that I've documented houses in Pembroke, the next town over from Duxbury, and in Duxbury itself. Probably the best way to capture that is go on my website, and under the suffrage tab, there's a list of suffrage sites that I've documented, and I do list them by town, so you can see the ones for Pembroke, and I think the ones for Duxbury are listed there too. And again, if you have any questions, email me through my website, lylenyberg.com.
Charlie Clapp offers you a tip, perhaps. He says that the Dorchester Historical Society resides in the Clapp House. You might start there to find out more about the Clapp family.
Okay.
And then Susanna has one more question for you. Can you tell her when the Scituate Light was rebuilt?
Oh, well, it was acquired by the town in early 1900s as a result of activity by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And by the actions of a person there in town government who realized the property was up for auction and could be sold to anyone. And so he grabbed some money and went up to Boston and paid down payment to preserve the property. So we got several people to thank for that. I don't think has ever gone back into service. There's the Minot Lighthouse, which took over in 1848 or so from the Scituate Lighthouse and I think is still in service. And there's a little light at the end of the jetty near the old Scituate Lighthouse that is used as an aid to mariners. But I can't tell you when the light went back up on top of the lighthouse, but it's got to be sometime in the 1900s.
Wonderful. It seems like the other questions have slowed down a little bit. I want to say thank you very much for your time tonight. Thank you for volunteering to be here for our annual meeting. And certainly it was wonderful to hear the Duxbury connections, but also how you used the Drew Archival Library for your research. It's always wonderful to see how our work helps other people do their work. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I really appreciated it. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
And I just want to offer one final thank you to all of you, our members, for joining us tonight for the 2020 annual meeting. It's wonderful to look backward and celebrate the accomplishments of the last year. And of course, look forward to seeing you all in the coming year. Thank you very much for coming and have a wonderful evening.